Good morning, everyone. Let's put up a quick video about Chapter 16, which is the sale of personal property. Very significant part of business law, as I previously referred to in a past video. Property that's subject to it, this only applies to movable, identifiable, tangible property. It doesn't apply to real estate, and it doesn't apply to intangible property, um, things like I give examples in the book. Evidences of ownership, such as copyright, certificates of stock accounts, notes receivable, um, sometimes called a chosen action. Don't worry about it, but intellectual property is different than personal, tangible personal property. And that's all this chapter about is personal property that's movable and identifiable and concrete, tangible. Sales and contracts to sell, we have to distinguish between the two. A sale is just that. You go into a store, you buy the mug, you bring it home. The minute you gave the money and they gave you the right to possess the goods, that's a sale. It's over. It's consummated. It's all done one and the same. What we're trying to distinguish is that between that and what we call a contract to sell. They're both legally binding, but one is done at the very moment of contract creation. That's a sale. It's just done. All the terms are met right in that moment. Many times we go in and say I went into a Toyota dealership and I want a new Prius. And I said, yeah, I'm very excited. And they talk terms and we figure out it's one of these no haggle places. This is the price. And I say, okay. And I come up with the money and they say, oh, well, we should have your new Prius here in 10 days. That is a binding contract, but it's not a sale because it's not done yet. When you hear the term a sale, it means it's completed. This is something about related to what we call futures contracts. We'll get to that in a minute. But generally speaking, either the Toyota dealership doesn't have yet possession of the car or it's not even created yet. So they might own it, but it might be at a another location across the country and it has to be traveled to the the locality where I went to that dealership to get it. That's a contract to sell. Why do we care? In a contract to sell, risk of loss hasn't transferred to me, the buyer. Although I might have contractual rights, I might even have some right to insure the goods because there's an economic expectation to suffer loss if those goods are damaged, because it might be for business purposes and things like that. But generally speaking, in a contract to sell, risk of loss remains with the seller because either the good doesn't exist yet, or if it does exist, it's in the possession and control of the seller or his or her agents. The buyer has no ability to possess and therefore control the goods. Why do we care? Because things happen. Government might seize the goods and might try to seize them from me, saying I owe taxes. But if I don't possess the goods yet, can they possess? Can they repossess them from the seller of the goods? And these kinds of questions come up all the time. And usually we determine whether if it's a sale, it's completed, whoever possesses it. And that's the big one. Who bears the risk of loss? The owner. On a contract to sale, I am not the owner yet. I am simply got contractual rights to become the owner when either the goods come into existence or they become delivered to an area where I can exercise dominion and control. That's the big difference. Owners bear risk. On a contract to sell, I'm not yet the owner. How do we know if the contract is for the sale of goods or for services? This comes up all the time. I'll bring it back to I think a funny example back in the day when I was a kid. But think about it. You hire someone to put in new hardwood floors in your house. Are hardwood floors movable, tangible items? Yeah, they're pieces of wood. However, it's also a service contract. Someone is going to install those floors into my home. The question is now we have a mixed contract. It's both for services and for goods. The UCC Article 2 only applies to the sale of goods. It does not apply to services. So what are we going to do? Is it a contract for sale of goods? Contract for services? Both. The UCC applies if it's a predominantly a contract for the sale of goods. How do we determine it? Well, which is most predominant? Usually determine what if the contract 75% of it is for the flooring, 25% is for the installing. It's predominantly a sale of contract or a sale of goods. So therefore, the UCC does apply and these rules apply. And we often have mixed contracts like that. Think about if you go get your car repaired, it might need a fairly simple part, but to get at it, they might have to take off the head of your engine and do all kinds of labor involved. And so you get a bill at the end, and it's $1,000. 750 of it was for labor and 250 of it was for parts. That is predominantly a service contract, and therefore the UCC and these rules don't apply. Traditional contract principles would. What's interesting about that, the funny story, I had a motorcycle when I was in high school, and I used to drive back and forth on a permit to school, even in the winter. I used to drive it all the time because I didn't want to go to bus. So I used to drive this motorcycle back and forth to school, and it was a kickstart motorcycle. It was a Honda, and the kickstart thing broke off like internally. I could still start it if I went down a hill and engage the clutch and get it running. Well, I couldn't take it anymore, and I wanted to get it fixed. So I took it to the Honda dealership, and I remember meeting with the mechanic, and he looks at it and goes, I said, I always remember, how much are the parts? And he said something like, I don't know, like, oh, it's a $12.75 part. This is back in the, I hate to admit it, 1980s, early 1980s. I said, great. And so I come back on, 2 weeks later with my dad to pick it up, and we get this bill for like $300. And they had to apparently take the motor off the frame of the bike to get at the guts to put this new, magneto crank thing kickstart. And the kickstart was cheap. It was all this service. And I remember, of course, I came up with a $20 bill thinking that's what I was going to pay. And I remember my father having to go to the $300. And we were not a wealthy family. And I can always remember my father. He's never hit me once in his life. He's dead now, but he never hit me once in his life. But boy, he wound up a lot. He just always pulled back like he was going to punch me. He'd get so upset over stuff. And it was kind of a comical thing. But I remember him briefly chasing me in the Honda parking lot in Chicopee, Massachusetts when I was a kid because he wanted to kill me because he had to pay for the service contract. It wasn't a contract for the sale of goods alone. It was predominantly a service contract. But we do have to distinguish between the two because the rules might be slightly different from classical sort of common law principles on a service contract to these UCC rules that come up. Price, does price always have to be in a contract? Most of the times it's material, meaning that we don't really have a meeting of the minds unless we set price. But sometimes it's not. Think about it. If I go in and I order some parts for something and I never ask for the price, we'll deem it the reasonable standard in the marketplace for those kinds of goods, and therefore price wouldn't be critical because we truly did have a meeting in mind. I had the intent to buy, seller had the intent to sell, and we had the specific amounts of the good. I'm buying 5 of these screws. I don't know what the price is because I just really need those screws. It's going to be the reasonable market value of those. If it was really outrageous, then we wouldn't have a contract. Be careful on that one. And then sometimes we can put in the contract that the price will be set by some standard, like, if I'm buying so many ounces of silver for my dentist's place, we'll set it at the price of the market at noontime for the price of silver bullion. I don't know. That's a terrible example. They don't obviously make up their own silver amalgamate for their dentist shop. I don't think they do. Anyways. Now we have to distinguish between existing goods and future goods. Existing goods are goods that not only exist, the stapler exists already, and I possess it now. That's simple. And why do we care? Because we're trying to distinguish, is something a contract to sell, because then the risk of loss and damage and thing is going to be still borne by the seller, where an existing good, if it's available and I'm selling it and it exists and I possess it, it's a sale. We're trying to distinguish between the two. Most people think future goods means they must not exist. Well, in legal terminology, when it means existing, it also means not only does it exist, but I have the power to possess and transfer. So say I was, no pun intended, Staples company, and they wanted to sell me the stapler. It might exist, but it's not at that store that they're located at right now. It's at some big distributing warehouse. So that's a contract to sell because it's a future good. Although the good exists, it doesn't meet the second element. It's not available for the seller to transfer title to me at that moment. Therefore, risk of loss won't pass to me until it's made available for me to retrieve it from the destination place where we had agreed upon. Future good, those of you that are in Gardner, this is Wachusett Community College class, and some of you probably grew up in Gardner or lived there for a long time. And my father was always, when I got the job teaching up there, he was still alive, and he was a big history buff, and he talked about how Gardner was once the furniture capital of the world. And I guess there's still some history there now, but it isn't quite what it used to be in, I guess, the 30s, 40s, and 50s to make a ton of furniture. And think about it, if you had some money or wealthy and you wanted a unique item made, you could have gone to some of these, real master craftsmen, artistic carpentry shops, furniture shops. You can go in there and you could say, I want a china cabinet, and they might have a bunch of patterns and you could pick from, or you could supply your own pattern. That's a future good. You might have a binding contract at that moment. You might have even already paid for it, but the good is a future good because it hasn't yet been manufactured. or it has, or it's in its rough form. It hasn't been stained and polyurethane and all that kind of stuff. The steps that go into finishing a project. That's a future good. Why do we care? Risk of loss, liability, claims of creditors, things like that, all can come up to determine who actually owns that goods in a specific moment. In a sale, the buyer owns it now. They have possessory rights, and it exists. In a future good, it remains with the seller until some later date, until the goods are either processed or they're made available for the buyer to retrieve. It's pretty straightforward. Boring chapter as hell. I get it. Um, but I want to keep them short. Read the chapter. There's some test material on it. But I don't think it's that difficult to mow through, other than being very dry.